And now for news of our own West Coast, we take you to Los Angeles and the report of Byron Palmer.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific wartime this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Army officials declined to comment on the possibility that the object might have been a blimp. However, it required nearly 30 minutes to travel some 25 miles, far slower than an airplane. Watchers on the rooftop of the Columbia Broadcasting Building in the heart of Hollywood could plainly see the flashes of guns and searchlights sweeping the skies in a wide arc along the coastal area. Concussion of the shells could be felt in downtown Los Angeles, 15 miles away. U.S. Army planes quickly took to the dark skies, but whether they contacted the object has not been announced. Army officials say they will not comment until they receive a full report of the action. Although some watchers say they saw airplanes in the air, semi-official sources say they probably were the U.S. Army's pursuit. Several observers say they saw one or more planes spotlighted by 20 or 30 searchlights.
One of the biggest UFO sightings in history, the Battle of Los Angeles. With the increase in sightings of UFOs all over the world, today we take a look back at one of the largest, most debated mass sightings in UFO history, known as the Battle of Los Angeles, also known as the Great Los Angeles Air Raid. It's the name given by contemporary sources to a rumored attack on the mainland of the United States by Japan and the subsequent anti-aircraft military barrage, which took place in the late hours of the 24th of February until the early morning hours of the 25th of February in 1942 over Los Angeles, California. The incident occurred less than 3 months after the United States entered World War II in response to the Imperial Japanese Navy's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and 1 day after the bombardment of Elwood near Santa Barbara on the 23rd of February. Initially, the target of the aerial barrage was thought to be an attacking force from Japan. But speaking at a press conference shortly afterwards, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called the purported attack a, quote, false alarm. Newspapers of the time published a number of reports and speculations of a cover-up. When documenting the incident in 1949, the United States Coast Artillery Association identified a meteorological balloon set aloft at 1 a.m. as having started all the shooting, and concluded that once the firing started, imagination created all kinds of targets in the sky, and everyone joined in. In 1983, the U.S. Office of Air Force History attributed the event to a case of, quote, war nerves, triggered by a lost weather balloon and exacerbated by stray flares and shell bursts from adjoining batteries. In the months following the Imperial Japanese Navy's attack of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941 and the United States' entry into World War II the next day, public outrage and paranoia intensified across the country, especially on the west coast of the United States, where fears of the Japanese attack or an invasion of the mainland were acknowledged as realistic possibilities. In Juneau, Alaska, residents were told to cover their windows for a nightly blackout after rumored spreads that Japanese submarines were lurking along the southeast Alaskan coast. Rumors of Japanese aircraft carrier was cruising off the coast of the San Francisco Bay Area, resulting in the city of Oakland's closing of schools and issuing a blackout. Civil defense sirens provided by Oakland Police Department cars blared through the city, and radio silence was ordered. The city of Seattle also imposed a blackout of all buildings and vehicles, and owners who left the lights on in their building had their businesses smashed by a mob of 2,000 residents. The rumors were taken so seriously that 500 United States Army troops moved into the Walt Disney Studios in the Burbank, California area to defend the famed Hollywood facility and the nearby factories against enemy sabotage or air attacks. As the United States began mobilizing for the war, anti-aircraft guns were installed, bunkers were built, and air raid precautions were drilled into the populace over the country. Contributing to the paranoia was the fact that many American merchant ships were indeed attacked by Japanese submarines in waters off the west coast, especially from the last half of December 1941 through February. On February 24th, 1942, U.S. Naval Intelligence issued a warning that an attack on mainland California could be expected within the next 10 hours. That evening, many flares and blinking lights were reported in the vicinity of defense plants. An alert was called at 7:18 p.m. and was lifted at 10:23 p.m. Renewed activity began early in the morning of the 25th of February. Air raid sirens sounded at 2:25 a.m. throughout Los Angeles County. A total blackout was ordered and thousands of air raid wardens were summoned to their positions. At 3:16 a.m., the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade began firing 50 caliber machine guns and 12.8-pound anti-aircraft shells into the air above Los Angeles City at reported aircraft. Over 1,400 shells were eventually fired into the night skies. Pilots of the 4th Interceptor Command were alerted, but their aircraft remained grounded. The artillery fire continued sporadically until 4:14 a.m. The all clear was sounded and the blackout order was lifted at 7:21 a.m. Several buildings and vehicles were damaged by shell fragments, and 5 civilians died as an indirect result of the anti-aircraft fire. 3 were killed in car accidents in the ensuing chaos, and 2 of heart attacks attributed to stress from the hour-long action. The incident was front-page news along the U.S. Pacific coast and across the nation. Within hours of the end of the air raid, Secretary of Navy Frank Knox held a press conference saying the entire incident had been a false alarm due to anxiety and, quote, war nerves. Knox's comments were followed by statements from the Army the next day that reflected General George C. Marshall's supposition that the incident might have been caused by enemy agents using commercial airplanes in a psychological warfare campaign to generate panic. Some contemporary press outlets suspected a cover-up of the truth. An editorial in the Long Beach Independent wrote, "There is a mysterious reticence about the whole affair, and it appears that some sort of censorship is trying to halt discussion on the matter." Speculation was rampant as to invading airplanes and their bases. Theories include a secret base in northern Mexico, as well as Japanese submarines stationed offshore with the capability of carrying planes. Others speculated that the incident was either staged or exaggerated by our own military to give coastal defense industries an excuse to move further inland. Representative Leland Ford of Santa Monica called for a congressional investigation, saying, quote, "None of the explanations so far offered removed the episode from the category of complete mystification." Now, one of the issues of the official narrative is the radar. Radars picked up an unidentified target 120 miles west of Los Angeles. Anti-aircraft batteries were alerted at 2:15 and were put on green alert, ready to fire a few minutes later. The AAF kept its pursuit planes on the ground, preferring to await indications of the scale and direction of any attack before committing its limited fighter force. Radars tracked the approaching target to within a few miles of the coast, and at 2:21 a.m., the regional controller ordered a blackout. Therefore, the information center was flooded with reports of, quote, enemy planes, even though the mysterious object tracked in from the sea seems to have vanished. At 2:43 a.m., planes were reported near Long Beach, and a few minutes later, a Coast Artillery colonel spotted about, quote, 25 planes at 12,000 feet over Los Angeles. At 3:06 a.m., a balloon carrying a red flare was seen over Santa Monica, and 4 batteries of anti-aircraft artillery opened fire, whereupon the air over Los Angeles erupted like a volcano. From this point on, reports were hopelessly at variance. Civilian sightings raise more questions. Probably much of the confusion came from the fact that anti-aircraft shell bursts caught by the searchlights were themselves mistaken for enemy planes. In any case, the next 3 hours produced some of the most imaginative reports of the war. Everything from swarms of planes, sometimes balloons, of all sizes and numbers, numbering from 1 to several hundred, traveling at altitudes which ranged from a few thousand feet to more than 20,000 feet, and flying at speeds which were said to have varied from very slow to over 200 miles per hour, were observed to parade across the skies. These mysterious forces dropped no bombs, and despite the fact that 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition were directed against them, they suffered no losses. There were reports, to be sure, that 4 enemy planes had been shot down, and one was supposed to have landed in flames at Hollywood intersection. Residents in a 40-mile arc along the coast watched from hills and rooftops as the play of guns and searchlights provided real drama of the war for citizens of the mainland. The dawn which ended the shooting and the fantasy also proved that the only damage which resulted in the city was such as it had been caused by the excitement, and at least one death due to heart failure, a couple due to traffic accidents due to the blackout on the streets. Attempts to arrive at an explanation of the incident quickly became as involved and mysterious as the battle itself. The Navy immediately insisted that there was no evidence of the presence of enemy planes, and Frank Knox announced at a press conference on the 25th that the air raid was just a false alarm. At the same conference, he admitted that the attacks were always possible and indicated that vital industries located along the coast ought to be moved inland. The Army had a hard time making up its mind on the cause of the alert. A report to Washington made by the Western Defense Command shortly after the raid had ended indicated that the credibility of reports of an attack had begun to be shaken before the blackout lifted. This message predicted that developments would prove that most previous reports had been greatly exaggerated. The 4th Air Force had indicated its belief that there were no planes over Los Angeles, despite the many reports that there were many planes over Los Angeles. But the Army did not publish these initial conclusions. Instead, it waited a day until after a thorough examination of witnesses had been finished. On the basis of these hearings, local commanders altered their verdict and indicated a belief that from 1 to 5 unidentified airplanes had been over Los Angeles. Many planes, no planes, a few planes. Problems between departments. The divergence of views between the War and the Navy departments and the unsatisfying conjecture advanced by the Army to explain the affair touched off a vigorous public discussion. The Los Angeles Times, in a first-page editorial on February 26 announced that the considerable public excitement and confusion caused by the alert, as well as its spectacular official accompaniments, demand a careful explanation. Fears were expressed lest a few phony raids undermine the confidence of civilian volunteers in the aircraft warning service. In the United States Congress, Representatives Leland Ford wanted to know whether the incident was a practice raid, or a raid to throw a scare into 2 million people, or a mistaken identity raid, or a raid to take away Southern California's war industries. Many possibilities. A strong editorial in the Washington Post on February 27th called the handling of the Los Angeles episode a, quote, recipe for jitters, and censured the military authorities for what is called stubborn silence in the face of widespread uncertainty. The editorial suggested that the Army's theories that commercial planes might have caused the alert explains everything except where the planes came from, where they were going, and why no airplanes, American airplanes, were sent in pursuit of them. The New York Times on February 28th expressed a belief that the more the incident was studied, the more incredible it became. Quote, if the batteries were firing at nothing at all, as Secretary Knox implies, it is a sign of expensive incompetence and jitters. If the batteries were firing on real planes, some of them as low as 9,000 feet, as Secretary Stimmons declares, why were they completely ineffective? Why did no American planes go up to engage them? or even to identify them. What would have happened if this had been a real air raid? These questions were appropriate, but for the War Department to have answered them in full frankness would have involved an even more complete revelation of the weakness of our air defenses. The conclusion at the end of the war, the Japanese stated that they did not send planes over the area at the time of this alert, although submarines launched aircraft were subsequently used over Seattle. A careful study of the evidence suggests that a meteorological balloon known to have been released over Los Angeles may have well caused the initial alarm. This theory is supported by the fact that anti-aircraft military units were officially criticized for having wasted ammunition on targets which moved too slowly to have been airplanes. After the firing started, careful observation was difficult because of the drifting smoke and shell bursts. The acting commander of the anti-aircraft artillery brigade in the area testified that he had first been convinced that he had seen 15 planes in the air, but had quickly decided that he was seeing smoke. Competent correspondents like Ernie Powell and Bill Henry expressed the shooting and wrote that they were never able to make out an airplane. It is hard to see in any event what enemy purpose would have been served by an attack which included no bombs being dropped, unless perhaps it was for the purpose of reconnaissance. It doesn't take into consideration accounts like this.
When we first saw it, the object was hanging motionless almost directly overhead. In other words, it appeared when I first stepped out the door and looked up, it seemed to be hovering.
The UFO theory. A photo published in the Los Angeles Times on the 26th of February 1942 has featured in UFO conspiracy theories as evidence of an extraterrestrial visitation. They assert that the photo clearly shows searchlights focused on an alien spaceship. However, the photo was heavily modified by photo retouching prior to publication, a routine practice in graphic arts of the time intended to improve the contrast in black and white photos. It should be noted that the explosive fragments do not fly around in the sky for a long time. UFO sightings in Los Angeles in 1942 continues to hold various secrets. While the incident is still widely debated among enthusiasts of UFO conspiracy theories, with the advancement of technology, many people have confirmed it is an alien spacecraft. George C. Marshall, who was Army Chief of Staff at the time, stated this, quote, "The mystery airplanes are in fact not earthly, and according to secret intelligence sources, they are in all probability of interplanetary origin," end quote. Such a strange comment to make from what seemingly was a false alarm or a weather balloon. Often we see such comments as these either covered up or omitted from official records. A weather balloon. This was given as a reason in 1948, so close to the events of Roswell, which was also just a weather balloon. Interesting. We may not ever know what occurred in the early morning hours of the 25th of February in 1942, but could it be that in the skies over Hollywood that night, that science fiction became reality? We thank you for watching.